Hello everybody, and welcome back to more Necromancer feedback, this time for the Rathma set for build 45704. Now, I have a pretty significantly different build, or rather, a very different playstyle compared to what other people are doing with the Rathma set at the moment on the leaderboards. That said, and I should probably get this out of the way, those builds that people are running are using Rathma Shield, the passive that gives you immunity for 4 seconds after using Army of the Dead or Land of the Dead. Personally, I do not want to use it because I find anything that gives you immunity boring and badly designed. And there's a few reasons for that. I think that if something gives you immunity, it's either going to be really, really good, as in it's too good, or it's going to be completely useless. There is no middle ground with something that gives you immunity, because it's either you're going to have it up far too often, and then that's why it's really, really good, or you're not going to have it up not enough, and then it's completely useless. There is no middle ground. You're either going to have it because it's good, or you're not going to have it because it's bad. And I don't like that. I think, again, things that give you immunity are boring and badly designed, and I would love to see Rathma Shield removed from the beta for just some time, just to see how it goes, just to see how people build things, because I guarantee you it will be very interesting and way better. And nothing will change. You know, people will still be playing very similar builds. They'll just take Rathma Shield out, and I think that that is fine. That also does mean that maybe increasing the damage on things so you can continue to do the same greater rift levels, since you're not using an immunity, means that yeah, you'll have to kind of adjust and balance around that. But I just don't want to use Rathma Shield. So that aside, and that out of the way, I have come up with a build that uses some similarities as those other people. And I made my build before looking up that they were running, and I have come to similar conclusions with certain things, but in very different ways. And I like my build because it's really fun, and I've optimized it since the footage in the background, mostly because I made a mistake on my build, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And after fixing that, I can do Greater Rift 85 pretty comfortably with this build, considering the people who are running Rathma Shield, the immunity passive, are able to do low 90s, like 90 to 93. I feel pretty confident that this is a really good build because I'm able to pretty much be within a reasonable margin of them, even without using an immunity. So my build revolves around the Skeletal Mage Singularity rune. So Singularity is when you put Skeletal Mage out, it consumes all of your essence to summon a more powerful mage, and its damage is increased by 3% for every point of essence you consume. So if easy math here, if you had 100 essence, you use a Skeletal Mage, it would then increase the damage by 300%. In my current build, not in the one in the background, I am running over 300 essence, so each Skeletal Mage is getting a massive damage boost. On top of that, they've kind of adjusted the 6-set bonus for Rathma's set. It is now each Skeletal Mage increases the damage of your minions in Army of the Dead by 250%. It was by 200%. So if you can have a maximum of 10 mages out, and if you're running the ring that is summoning 2 of them and making them last a little bit longer, it all kind of really works very, very well together. And then on top of that, they've changed the weapon set, the Jesseth weapon set, which it used to be that it gave Army of the Dead a rune. And that rune wasn't all that great. It looked really good on paper, but it never really seemed to do much. So nobody ever really ran that weapon set. Instead, they use the old Death's Scythe, which is now called Nir's Black Death, which is increased your damage based on what poison skills you were using, or how many poison skills you were using. So the new one, the new weapon set, is when the target of your command skeletons dies, the skeletons are automatically commanded to attack a nearby target. And then the next bit of that is when your skeletons are commanded to attack a target, all of your minions deal 400% increased damage. So you could see how this is really buffing those skeletal mages that are already buffed from the Singularity rune. And then are being buffed by Rathma set and then the weapon set. So on top of that, Command Skeletons, which is not necessarily a great ability, with this setup, it becomes very good. And it is also gaining the damage bonus from all that. On top of that, and this is where one of those like similarities between their builds and my builds come in, is we've all decided to go with the Shadow Hook on this one. So the Shadow Hook, it used to be just that Bone Spike generated an additional 5 essence each time it hit an enemy. Now it is every point of maximum essence increases your damage by 0.5%, and Bone Spikes generates 5 additional essence for each enemy hit. This is a pretty good weapon. It competes with other weapons. I think that 0.5% is okay. It's a reasonable percentage of damage increase that you're getting off of the weapon. It's not nearly as much as some of the other weapons. You know, for example, if you look at the bone armor weapon, that increases your damage of your secondary skills by 300% while bone armor is active. That is a much higher percentage increase of damage than the Shadow Hook. That said, it only affects secondary skills. So Shadow Hook affects all of your stuff, which works very, very well if you're running pets. So that's why that percentage is lower. I would like to see a bit higher, but I think it's fine the way it is, the way everything's shaking out right now. So on top of that, on top of using that, I am using Bone Spikes, which is indeed giving me a ton of essence anytime I hit a group of enemies because of the weapon. And I am also running max essence. I have max essence on the weapon, 20. I have max essence in my Paragon points. And I'm just trying to get as much essence as possible. I'm using a passive that's increasing my essence. So I'm getting a pretty reasonable damage boost from the weapon in my cube. And because of my max essence, my skeletal mages are gaining a pretty significant damage boost. Aside from that, in my cube, I'm using Tasker and Theo. This is something that I've noticed I've differed on with a lot of people. As far as building this set, they seem to like using Land of the Dead as a skill, and then using the Bloodsong Mail in the cube, which is while in Land of the Dead, Command Skeletons gain the effect of all runes and deal like 125% increased damage. So that's pretty good, but I've already told you that I'm building my build around the Skeletal Mage Singularity rune. So having Land of the Dead not only is taking up a spot on my bar, but it also is trying to buff Command Skeletons. Command Skeletons are not my source of damage here. Finally, and this is the most interesting part, is because I think a lot of testers, when they saw the change, they assumed that it was still for a very specific item, or rather a build with Bone Spear. But Kreisbin's Sentence used to give you a ton of damage additional to Bone Spear, and I think that once they changed it, it now no longer does that. It just increases your damage completely based on all of your skills. It's not like any specific skill. What it reads is you deal 100% increased damage against slowed enemies, or triple the bonus against enemies that are afflicted by any other type of control impairing effect. So I think a lot of people, when they saw the change, thought, oh, that's still the Bone Spear one, right? That's still the one that's going to get the additional damage from Bone Spear, and I think it was Bone Spirit and Bone Spikes all did additional damage. Now it's just across the board. So I'm using that in my cube, which again is buffing that Skeletal Mage. So I'm pretty sure you can already see how things are shaking out here with this build, and how it is interesting. And I find the Rathma set the most interesting right now to build for, because you have so many options. You know, the fact that I have arrived at a completely different conclusion as far as building the Necromancer with Rathmas as the other testers on the leaderboard, yet mine still competes with theirs to some extent. Like if they didn't have Rathma Shield, they would pretty much be in the same boat as I am. So I think that is fair enough to say that, like, this set is flexible. It has a lot of options on how you want to build it. I've tried using, you know, like Revive. I've tried using Command Golem. By the way, Command Golem is really frustrating at the moment, because you'll notice a lot of the time he just stands there. He's not attacking anything. He can't get in there, so he's just going to stand there. And you're like, come on, Golem. Like, I need your damage, and you're not doing it. And he could be a little frustrating, but that's the reason why I'm not using it in this build. And instead, I've gone with this buff my mage, have my mage do all the damage. On top of that, I need some damage reduction, right? So I'm using Dainty's Binding, which is I gain an additional 50% damage reduction when there is an enemy afflicted by my Decrepify. Just a really good belt, right? Just across the board, a really good belt now that they've changed it. And I am using Decrepify on my bars, which is giving me an additional 30% damage reduction because I am using the rune that makes it so it's 30% rather than the 20 or 25, and it lasts for 30 seconds. So I'm using that to get my damage reduction. I'm putting it on as many enemies as possible for the damage reduction against them on Decrepify. But on top of that, I'm using the two passives. Your curses cost 50% less essence and last forever. I'm using that mostly for both effects because I don't want to spend as much essence as possible on other skills. I want to use it on my mages. And having it last forever means that my other passive, I receive a 1% damage boost for each enemy afflicted by one of my curses, means that I'm gaining a huge damage bonus in huge packs of enemies, and I don't have to keep reapplying Decrepify to things. You know, I will use a combination of abilities. I'll use Army of the Dead with the Death Valley rune, which you see me using in the background, which groups them up. It's like a really good, suck ability. It just kind of brings everything together. Then I hit them with my Bone Spikes with Sudden Impact, which it's a kind of a small effect, but it is actually reasonably big enough to hit quite a bit of enemies, and it stuns the enemies for 1 second, which gains me that stun damage for my skeletal mages when they're sitting there doing their damage. Plus, they're all together, so I'm gaining a ton of essence anytime I hit them, right? So it's pumping my essence really high so I can keep throwing skeletal mages out there. Then I Decrepify them, which gains me all of that additional damage bonus against them because of all of the enemies afflicted with one of my curses, and they're all damage reduced, so it's like this really cool thing that everything is working together really, really well. At first, I was using Devour with the Aura because it's just a good ability, but the reason I was using Aura with this set in particular was because there was so much going on with trying to group everything up, trying to stun them, trying to put the mages out, trying to manage my essence, trying to make sure that my command skeletons were always on a target, and trying to curse everything. There was so much going on with that it's like, I'm going to forget to Devour. So I ran a Rift. You saw me, I'm running it in the background, and essentially I was using the Aura just to make sure that I could still Devour things, but I don't have to worry about it. I since had switched to Devour with Cannibalize rune, which means I actually have to hit the button, but it does help me heal myself when I need it, and it gives me that much needed essence. I feel like Devour is really good here, but I could run without it if I wanted to. Just other than that, the other passives I'm using is increase my maximum essence by 40, and then finally increase the duration of Skeletal Mage and revive by 25%. Having Skeletal Mage a little bit longer is very, very good. Now, what I've noticed with this set is that you can get a lot of damage out there. You don't necessarily need big AoE abilities because you have Army of the Dead, which is kind of like your big AoE hitter. You're using that essentially on cooldown when you feel it's appropriate. You kind of want to have all your mages out in order to do that, but that can kind of hard to be, or can be hard to do with my current build because you got to have the essence to get the mages out. So sometimes you just have to sacrifice good mages to get them out to make sure that your Army of the Dead is going to do a lot of damage. Then when everything is grouped up, then you can get good mages out. So it is kind of an interesting build that has a lot of dynamics to it, and I would say it has a skill cap that I have not reached. I have already started optimizing. I said at the beginning of the video there was something that I did wrong in the build, and that is I forgot to put my Paragon points in max essence in what you're watching in the background. So I went from doing this to doing an 80 and just breezing through it. With that change, I have plenty of damage reduction, I feel. When I actually had done that change, I didn't die a single time in the 80, and I never really ever got close to dying in that 80. Some of that is down to what mobs I had, so fishing for a good set of mobs is going to be really good for this one, especially melee ones, I feel. Some of the other things that you can change out is you could use Brig's Wrath, which is a legendary ring, which It means uncursed enemies are pulled to a target location when you curse them. So that could be very good if you're trying to like group them up. But then that kind of has anti-synergy with the curses lasting forever because you only really get one good pull on them. But that does work well if you're not using that passive. It does work well with bone spikes because, you know, you get them all grouped together. Obviously, you're generating more essence, right? So I'm pretty sure you're kind of seeing how this all works together. Overall, it's a really fun and a really good build, and I really enjoy playing it. I think that where I could improve is just basically getting my gear a bit better, maybe changing some gems around. I'm not sure. I am using strong arm bracers to gain the additional damage bonus off of Army of the Dead when it knocks everybody back, but I might actually change that for Ancient Parthenons, the higher Greater Rift I get, because I'm stunning things reliably with bone spikes. And having all those enemies stunned after I Army of the Dead them gives me a massive boost to damage reduction, even though that stun only lasts for 1 second, which you wouldn't think would work really well with that Skeletal Mage rune and having them do damage with Crisman's Sentence, the ring. But it actually does. It does really well, and I have burned through Greater Rift Guardians, especially with the optimizations I've made since the video in the background. And you can also just kind of change things. Like you could use a Hellfire Amulet. Like there's a lot of options here. You can use different rings. I think the only 2 rings that are non-negotiable are the Skeletal Mage ring, which summons another mage and they last longer, and Crisman's Sentence. So you have a ring slot available and you have an amulet slot available. Again, I said that I'm using Tasker and Theo, but there are other pieces of armor that you can use to work with this, such as and this is an interesting one, but it would work, which is Requiem Seraplate, I think is how you pronounce it. Devour restores an additional, I think it goes up to 80, oh, it's 100% essence and life. In addition, when Devour restores essence or life above your maximum, the excess is granted over 3 seconds. That would be really good with this build, though you want to be getting the additional damage from Tasker and Theo. You could run Revive in some of the places. You can change out some abilities, run Revive, and then run with a mask that increases the damage of Revive. You could run, if you're doing that, you could run a Golem and then run the gloves. That means that your Golem is shedding corpses, so then you actually have corpses to revive if you don't want to run Land of the Dead. You could, with the same build I'm running in the background, you could run a Ring of Royal Grandeur and then run the new boots, which attacking with Bone Spikes has a 30% chance to cast Bone Nova at the target location. Unfortunately, I don't think Death Nova does much damage at the moment, so that's not quite useful. Then you have things like the Shoulders, which Skeletal Mage gains Gift of Death, which is the one that leaves a corpse behind. You have the Pants, which is your Golem is increased damage by like 120%. You take 30% less damage while it's active. Like there's a lot of things that you could do to make this build really, really good or different. And I think they would all be fairly equal, and I like that a lot. If you really needed more Greater Rift Guardian damage, you could run Bone Ringer, which is the damage bonus of your command skeletons increased by 30% every second they spend attacking the same target. So it's like a much better version of the gem. So, you know, it's a little different, but it would work very well. You could potentially run Trag'oul's Corroded Fang if you don't have enough max essence, which is Curse Scythe rune for Grim Scythe. Now has a 100% chance to apply a curse, and you deal 200% increased damage to cursed enemies. You could switch that out for the Shadow Hook. Not run Decrepify on your bars, just hit things with your Trag'oul's weapon, right? With the Grim Scythe, you're generating a lot of additional essence because of the way Grim Scythe works, so it scales really well with density of mobs. Plus, you're gaining technically a bit more damage boost on those enemies than you would if you were using Shadow Hook. So it's like, there's so many options here that I feel like you could do some really cool things. So I guess my feedback for the set is get rid of Rathma Shield and you'll see more interesting builds pop up. Because without having the temptation of taking Rathma Shield, then you don't have to have Land of the Dead on your bar. You don't necessarily have to have Army of the Dead on your bar at that point either. You can kind of switch it up a bit and you would see more interesting builds coming into the Rathma set because more people would be tempted to do what I'm doing, which is like running weird things that they find interesting, and that would work really well. Like make a Rathma set built around Revive, or make one built around your Golem or something like that, and you could come up with really fun ideas based on that. And I like that. I like that a lot. So I don't think Rathma needs to change at all. I don't think Rathma needs a buff, but I do believe that maybe some of the other items, when they're changed to adjust some of the other sets, you'll see them now used in Rathmas, because Rathmas does have a lot of flexibility to it, to the point where you can come up with some really cool builds that you necessarily wanted before. So yeah, Rathmas is really good. It doesn't need any changing. My feedback on it is get rid of Rathma Shield. And I know that's really weird because it has nothing to do with Rathma's set necessarily, but I think it kind of kills the creativity of builds happening in the beta at the moment. Plus, I find it boring and badly designed. It's just like, it's that easy. I don't like things that give you immunity. I never have. They've never worked in the past, let's be honest. Who runs the immunity on the Serenity for monks? Not many people anymore. It was really good in that one like season where you could always have it up with Pillar of whatever that stupid thing's called, the bell. I don't remember. It was the Pillar of Lightning skill. It's just it doesn't, and nobody runs it anymore, right? Nobody runs that passive on Serenity because it doesn't necessarily do much. Maybe you do if you're a support, but even then, you know. So why even have Rathma Shield in the game if it's either always going to be run or never going to be run? It just doesn't make any sense. I know that's ranting, but that's how I feel about it. And that's the only thing that I really have for suggestions on Rathmas, because everything else is great. Again, once items are changed for other builds, you're going to see this build get a bit stronger. Other than that, yeah, I think it's very good. Let me know what you guys are running with Rathmas if you are in the beta, or any ideas you have for Rathmas, because I think there is so many angles for the set that I don't see that other people might, that could really help ideas for the future, or help other people come up with really cool builds that will then spur, you know, other really cool builds, which is always a good thing, especially when you're testing a set for a new class and trying to get it all balanced. But with that being said, we shall see you guys next time.